Tonight, we're going to experience something that medieval people did every single night, but which modern humans have almost completely forgotten how to do properly. We are going to sleep in a medieval home, which means sleeping in actual darkness, in actual quiet, in actual cold, without any of the conveniences you currently take for granted and probably do not appreciate enough. There will be no electric lights to gradually dim, no thermostats to adjust, no alarm clocks to set and then ignore repeatedly, no phones to scroll through while pretending you are about to sleep any moment now. Just darkness, silence, cold, and the shared warmth of other humans who also need to sleep, because tomorrow will be exactly as difficult as today was. This is not romantic. This is not cozy in the way modern people imagine medieval life being cozy. This is simply what sleep looked like for most of human history, and somehow everyone survived it, though not always comfortably. So settle in, let the day fall away, and prepare to experience sleep the way your ancestors did, which is to say, with significantly more awareness of how cold your feet are. Before we step into this nighttime world, take a moment to settle in. If you enjoy these journeys into history's quiet corners, consider subscribing to join us regularly. We would love to hear where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. There is something remarkable about knowing our community spans different places and time zones, all gathering here to explore the ordinary lives that made history possible. Now over to Corey, who'll take you through what comes next. Corey, they're all yours.
Let's begin. You are in a medieval peasant home in 14th century England, and the sun is setting, which means work is ending, not because anyone has decided to stop, but because seeing becomes impossible and continuing would result in injury. The transition from day to night is not gradual here. There are no street lights slowly illuminating, no indoor lights creating artificial extensions of daylight. When the sun goes down, darkness arrives with commitment, and humans must adjust accordingly or fall over things. The house you occupy is a single-room structure, which sounds romantic until you remember that single room means everyone is always present for everything. Privacy is not a concept that has been invented yet, or rather, it has been invented but is exclusively available to wealthy people who can afford multiple rooms, and the revolutionary idea that different activities might happen in different spaces. You do not have this luxury. Cooking, eating, working, sleeping, arguing, reconciling, giving birth, and dying all happen in this one room, which makes it very efficient and also very intense. The walls are wattle and daub, which is a fancy way of saying sticks woven together and covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and whatever else was available, possibly including animal dung because medieval people were practical about building materials and squeamishness was a luxury no one could afford. The walls are not particularly effective at keeping out cold or drafts, but they do create a distinction between inside and outside, which is the main requirement for a wall. They also provide something to lean against and somewhere to hang things, which are useful secondary functions. The roof is thatch, layers of straw or reeds carefully arranged to shed water, at least in theory. In practice, thatch sheds water when it is new and properly maintained, but develops leaks when it ages. And proper maintenance requires time and materials that are not always available. Your roof has some areas that are questionable, and everyone knows where those areas are because when it rains, water comes through and lands on specific spots, and you simply avoid those spots or place containers to catch the drips. This is accepted as normal because perfect roofs are expensive, and you are not expensive people. The floor is packed earth, dirt that has been walked on so many times it has compressed into something almost solid, almost smooth, though calling it smooth would be generous. It is uneven and occasionally muddy when water gets tracked in, and it develops dust that must be periodically swept out. And it is home to various insects that you share the space with, because eliminating them entirely would require efforts that could be better spent on literally anything else. The floor is covered with rushes, dried grass, or reeds that provide some insulation from the cold earth and can be swept out and replaced when they become too disgusting. Though the definition of too disgusting is fairly flexible as evening arrives. The first task is dealing with the chickens, because chickens have opinions about nighttime and must be secured before darkness fully arrives, or they will be eaten by foxes, who are extremely competent at their job and do not need encouragement. You go outside where the light is failing, the sky turning that particular shade of orange and purple that would be beautiful if you had time to appreciate it. But you do not, because chickens are surprisingly difficult to catch. When they suspect they are about to be put to bed, the chickens scatter with the indignant squawking of creatures who believe bedtime is a personal attack. You chase them with the resigned patience of someone who does this every evening and knows that fighting it is useless. Eventually, through a combination of persistence and the chicken's own exhaustion, you manage to herd them toward their coop, small wooden structure that serves as their bedroom and is about as luxurious as your own sleeping arrangements, which is to say, minimally functional. One chicken, the brown one who has always been difficult, makes a break for freedom at the last moment, sprinting past you with surprising speed for a bird whose brain is smaller than a walnut. You pursued her around the yard in a chase that would be comical if you were not getting increasingly annoyed and also increasingly aware that darkness is approaching, and you have other tasks to complete. Finally, you corner her against the fence, and she surrenders with poor grace, allowing herself to be carried to the coop where she joins her companions in radiating resentment. You close the coop door, securing it with a simple wooden latch that will keep the chickens in and hopefully keep predators out. Though foxes are clever and persistent and success is never guaranteed, the chickens settle onto their roosting bar, already fluffing their feathers and preparing for sleep with the enviable ability birds have to simply shut down when darkness arrives. You briefly envy them this talent, knowing that your own path to sleep will be longer and more complicated. Back inside, the family is engaged in the evening routine that happens every night with minor variations. Your husband is banking the fire, a process that requires careful attention because the fire must be preserved overnight to make morning easier. He covers the burning coals with ash, not so much that it smothers them, but enough to slow their burning, creating a state of suspended combustion that will last until morning when the fire can be rebuilt from these preserved coals. This banking process is crucial because making fire from scratch using flint and steel is annoying and time-consuming and occasionally results in minor injuries when the steel slips and catches your thumb. Everyone knows how to do it, but everyone prefers not to have to do it, so careful fire maintenance is a priority. Your husband performs this task with the focused attention of someone who has accidentally smothered the fire overnight before and does not wish to repeat the experience. Your children are engaged in the pre-sleep activities that children have been engaging in for all of human history, which is to say, avoiding sleep with increasingly creative excuses. Your daughter is 8 years old and convinced that she is not at all tired, despite obvious evidence to the contrary, is slowly, very slowly, putting away the spinning she has been working on. The slowness is deliberate, an attempt to extend the evening through sheer temporal manipulation, making each movement take 3 times longer than necessary. Your middle son, 5 years old, and operating on the logic of someone who believes sleep is a waste of time that could be spent doing literally anything else, is arguing that he is not tired. He makes this argument while rubbing his eyes and yawning, apparently unaware that his body is betraying his claims. You listen to his reasoning with the patient expression of a parent who knows that this argument happens every night and ends the same way, with him asleep, but who also knows that letting him make his case is easier than fighting about it. The baby, 18 months old and possessed of no strong opinions about bedtime, is already drowsy, leaning against your daughter and making the small whimpering sounds that indicate he is ready to sleep but wants to complain about it first, which is fair because sometimes you also want to complain about things even when they are inevitable and probably good for you. Your daughter picks him up with practiced competence, holding him in a way that suggests she has been doing this since she was barely bigger than him, which she has been. The light inside the house is failing along with the outside light. The open door and single small window providing illumination that is now mostly theoretical. You light a rushlight, a dried rush that has been soaked in fat and now serves as a primitive candle. It provides light in the same way that a single birthday candle provides light, which is to say, barely, creating a small circle of illumination that makes the surrounding darkness seem even darker by comparison. Rushlights are your evening lighting solution because candles are expensive and oil lamps are even more expensive, and you are neither of those things. The rushlight burns with a smoky flame that smells of whatever fat was used to soak it. In this case, probably mutton fat, giving the room the faint scent of cooked sheep. This is not unpleasant exactly, but it is noticeable, joining the other smells that characterize your home: smoke from the fire, mustiness from the damp walls, the animal smell of wool, the general scent of humans living in close quarters with minimal ventilation. You use the rushlight's minimal illumination to complete the evening tasks. The door must be barred for the night. It's a simple wooden beam that slides into brackets and prevents the door from being opened from outside. This is not sophisticated security, but it keeps out animals and discourages casual intruders. And casual intruders are the main concern because determined intruders are rare in a village where everyone knows everyone, and stealing from neighbors would result in immediate identification and social consequences. The window, which is just an opening in the wall covered by a wooden shutter, must also be closed. You secure the shutter, blocking the opening and immediately making the room darker and stuffier. The window serves multiple purposes during the day, providing light and ventilation in a way to see what is happening outside without having to actually go outside. At night, it must be closed to keep out cold and rain and animals who might consider entering, and closing it means accepting that the room will become increasingly stuffy as the night progresses, and multiple humans breathe the same air repeatedly. Your husband has finished with the fire and is now checking that the tools are properly stored, that nothing has been left out that should be put away, that tomorrow morning would not begin with searching for missing items. This nightly inventory is a habit formed from experience, from mornings when crucial items could not be found and work was delayed and tempers were short. Taking 3 minutes in the evening to organize prevents 30 minutes of frustration in the morning, which is simple mathematics that even exhausted people can appreciate. The children are being directed toward their sleeping area, a process that resembles herding cats if the cats were small humans with opinions and complaints. Your daughter helps settle the baby, laying him in the pile of blankets and straw that serves as the children's bed. The baby accepts this with minimal protest, his exhaustion finally overcoming his desire to participate in whatever is happening, which is nothing. But at 18 months, he seems to believe he might be missing something important. The 5-year-old is still maintaining that he is not tired, though his argument is losing coherence as his brain begins shutting down against his will. You listen with half your attention while completing your own preparations, gathering the blankets that will cover you and your husband, checking that everything is in order, mentally reviewing tomorrow's tasks, because your brain apparently cannot stop working, even when you desperately want it to. The sleeping arrangements in a medieval peasant home are straightforward and not particularly comfortable. The adults sleep on a simple platform raised slightly off the ground, filled with straw and covered with whatever bedding is available. This is considered an upgrade from sleeping directly on the floor, and it is an upgrade, though not a dramatic one. The platform provides some separation from the cold earth and the insects that inhabit it, and some is better than none, which is the general philosophy that guides most medieval life decisions. The children sleep together in their own pile of blankets and straw, a jumbled arrangement that will become more jumbled as the night progresses, and they shift and roll and somehow end up in positions that seem physically impossible. Siblings sleeping together provides warmth through shared body heat, which is one of the main heating technologies available to you. The more bodies in a pile, the warmer the pile, which is why families of 10 children, while exhausting, at least provide excellent insulation for each other. Your daughter settles the baby and then positions herself next to him, ready to respond if he wakes in the night, which he probably will because 18-month-olds have not yet developed the ability to sleep through the night consistently. She has taken on this role naturally, the oldest child becoming a secondary caretaker, learning the skills she will need for her own children by practicing on her younger siblings. This is both touching and slightly sad, childhood shortened by responsibility, but it is also simply how things work in a world where survival requires everyone's contribution. The 5-year-old finally abandons his argument about not being tired, his body making executive decisions that his mind no longer has the energy to override. He climbs into the sleeping pile and is unconscious within minutes, proving that his claims of wakefulness were optimistic at best. Children have this ability to fight sleep desperately and then surrender completely. No middle ground, just full resistance, followed by immediate unconsciousness. You and your husband make your own preparations for sleep, which are minimal because medieval people do not have extensive bedtime routines. You do not change into special sleeping clothes because special sleeping clothes are a luxury that has not been invented for your social class. You sleep in your undergarments, your linen shift, which is also what you wear under your day clothes and which will be worn until it requires washing, which happens when it becomes too dirty to ignore or when washing day arrives. Whichever comes first, your husband removes his outer tunic and hose, folding them with the care of someone who owns exactly 2 sets of clothes and cannot afford to damage either through carelessness. He places them where he can find them in the morning darkness, because fumbling for clothes in complete blackness is an excellent way to start the day, frustrated and possibly stepping on things that should not be stepped on. You check the children one final time, pulling the blanket more securely over them, tucking it in at the edges to trap warmth. The baby is already deeply asleep, his face peaceful in that way babies achieve. Completely relaxed and trusting that the world will continue existing while he is unconscious. The 5-year-old is sprawled in a position that suggests his bones have temporarily dissolved. The daughter sleeps with one arm over her younger brother, protective, even in sleep. The rushlight is burning low, the fat nearly consumed, the flame guttering and smoking more as it approaches the end of its fuel. You let it burn out rather than extinguishing it, because the small amount of light it provides for these final minutes is worth the small amount of fat consumed. When it finally dies, the darkness becomes complete, the kind of absolute black that only exists in places without artificial light. This darkness is disorienting if you're not accustomed to it, but you are accustomed to it because you've lived your entire life in it, every night for 30-some years. You know this darkness, know your way around the room in it, have memorized the positions of furniture and obstacles, can navigate by touch and memory when sight is impossible. This is a learned skill, this comfort with complete darkness, and you possess it the way you possess all skills necessary for survival. You settle onto the sleeping platform next to your husband, feeling the straw shift beneath you, finding the positions that are least lumpy and most comfortable, which is relative because comfortable is not really achievable on a straw mattress, only varying degrees of tolerable. The blanket, heavy wool that smells faintly of sheep and smoke, covers both of you, and you position yourselves to maximize warmth. Your back against his chest, sharing body heat because that is the primary heating system available. The house settles into nighttime quiet, the silence broken only by breathing and the occasional creak of the structure adjusting to temperature changes. Outside, the village is equally quiet, every household following the same pattern. People settling into sleep because there is nothing else to do in darkness, and sleep is free, and tomorrow will come whether you are ready or not. Your husband's breathing steepens quickly, exhaustion claiming him with the speed of someone who spent the day doing heavy physical labor and whose body is demanding rest immediately. You lie awake longer, your mind still processing the day's events, mentally reviewing tomorrow's tasks, listening to the children breathe, checking that everyone is settled and safe before you allow yourself to fully relax. The cold creeps in slowly, finding the gaps in your defenses, the places where the blanket does not quite cover, the space between bodies where heat escapes. Your feet are cold, will remain cold, because feet are always the last thing to warm up and the first thing to get cold, and apparently medieval technology has no solution for this beyond stuffing them closer to another human and hoping for the best. You shift slightly, seeking a more comfortable position, and your husband adjusts unconsciously, accommodating your movement. 11 years of marriage having taught him to respond to your adjustments in his sleep. This unconscious cooperation is one of the small miracles of long partnership. The way that people learn to share space harmoniously, even when neither is fully conscious. The darkness is absolute, complete, the kind of black that makes you uncertain whether your eyes are open or closed. You test this occasionally, opening and closing your eyes and seeing no difference, which is both disconcerting and entirely normal. This is what night is supposed to look like, what it has looked like for all of human history until very recently. And your ancestors navigated it successfully enough that you exist. So presumably, you will also manage. Sleep begins to pull at you. That heavy feeling that starts in your limbs and spreads through your body. Consciousness beginning to blur at the edges. Thoughts becoming less linear and more dreamlike. You let it come, surrendering to exhaustion, trusting that the night will pass safely and morning will bring its own challenges that you will face when they arrive. The house is dark and quiet and cold, and you are settling into sleep, surrounded by your family, sharing warmth and space and the simple fact of surviving another day together. This is what sleep looks like in a medieval home, unglamorous and uncomfortable and entirely normal. The way humans have slept for most of history and will sleep tonight and tomorrow and all the nights that follow until something, fundamental changes about how people live. But that change is centuries away. Tonight, you sleep as humans have always slept, in darkness and cold and proximity to family, finding what comfort you can and accepting what discomfort you must, because sleep is necessary and beds are what they are, and tomorrow comes. Regardless of how well you rested, the night deepens around you, the darkness complete, the silence profound, and you drift toward sleep, toward rest, toward the temporary surrender of consciousness that lets your body recover from today's demands and prepare for tomorrow's. Trench to sleep does not arrive instantly, despite your exhaustion and despite the fact that you have been working since before dawn and will work again tomorrow, starting before dawn in a cycle that will continue until you are physically unable to work anymore. Your body is tired enough to sleep immediately, but your mind has not received this memo and continues processing information with the determination of someone who believes that reviewing tomorrow's task list at night will somehow make tomorrow easier, which it will not, but the mind is optimistic about these things. You lie in the darkness, aware of multiple sensations competing for attention. The straw beneath you pokes through the thin mattress in several places, creating pressure points that are not quite painful but are definitely noticeable. You shift slightly, trying to find a configuration where fewer pieces of straw are actively stabbing you. But this is like trying to find a comfortable position on a pile of sticks, which is essentially what you were doing, because that is what straw is. Dried grass stems that have strong opinions about being lain upon. The blanket covering you is heavy and scratchy. Wool that has been washed but never processed enough to become truly soft. It provides warmth through sheer mass rather than through any quality of coziness, sitting on you like a textile boulder. You accept this because warm blue scratchy is superior to cold and comfortable, and those are your options. So you choose warmth and try to ignore the itching. Your husband has already achieved sleep with the speed of someone whose body makes executive decisions about consciousness without consulting his brain. He breathes in the deep, steady rhythm of the genuinely unconscious, occasionally producing small, snoring sounds that would be annoying. You are not so accustomed to them that they have become part of the ambient sound of night. After 11 years of marriage, his snoring is less annoying sound and more proof that he is alive and sleeping, which is reassuring in its own way. His body radiates heat like a personal furnace, and you position yourself to take maximum advantage of this, pressing your back against his chest, stealing his warmth shamelessly because he generates it without effort and you are perpetually cold. This is one of the practical benefits of marriage that no one mentions in wedding ceremonies. The shared body heat that makes winter nights survivable. Romance is nice, but reliable warmth is better, especially in October when temperatures are dropping and will continue dropping for months. The baby stirs in his sleep, making small sounds that are not quite waking, but are not quite sleeping either. That in-between state where he might settle back down or might wake fully and require attention. You listen carefully, your mother brain analyzing the sounds, determining whether intervention is needed. The sounds quiet, and he settles again. Crisis averted, and you relax back into your own pursuit of sleep. The 5-year-old shifts position dramatically, apparently trying to occupy more space than his small body should physically be able to fill. You hear the rustling of blankets as he repositions himself into whatever configuration his sleeping brain has determined is necessary, probably something involving all his limbs pointing in different directions like a starfish. Children have this ability to sleep in positions that would cause permanent injury in adults. Their flexible bodies tolerating arrangements that defy both logic and orthopedics. Your daughter remains still, sleeping quietly in the way that makes you occasionally check that she is still breathing, because silent sleep from a child feels suspicious after years of noisy sleep from children. But she is fine, simply sleeping peacefully, a skill she has developed earlier than her brothers, already showing the tendency toward responsibility and competence that will define her adult life, even in unconsciousness, managing to be the easy child. The darkness is so complete that you could not see your hand if you held it in front of your face, which you do not do because you know this already, and also because moving your hand would require effort, and you are trying to convince your body that you are sleeping. And sleeping people do not wave their hands around experimentally. The darkness has weight and texture pressing against your closed eyes, filling the space so thoroughly that it feels almost solid. This darkness would be frightening if you were not completely accustomed to it. But you've spent every night of your life in similar darkness, and it holds no fear for you. It is simply the natural state of nighttime, the way the world looks when the sun is not present to illuminate it. Modern humans will eventually invent ways to push back this darkness, filling nights with artificial light until darkness becomes rare and unfamiliar. But that is centuries in your future. For now, darkness is simply what happens after sunset, and you accept it the way you accept weather and seasons and the general structure of reality. Your mind continues its unhelpful cataloging of concerns. The brown hen was acting strange today, which might indicate illness or might indicate that she is preparing to go broody, and either way, it requires monitoring. The roof has developed a new leak, or possibly the old leak has expanded. And this needs addressing before winter arrives properly, and the leak becomes a serious problem rather than a minor annoyance. Your husband's cough has persisted for 3 weeks now, which is probably nothing but could be something. And you cannot afford for it to be something because if he cannot work, everything collapses. You are aware that thinking about these things is preventing sleep. Okay, you try to quiet your mind, focusing on breathing, on the warmth of the blanket, on the sounds of your family sleeping around you. This works for approximately 30 seconds before your brain helpfully reminds you that you need to check whether there is enough grain for the chickens and whether the 5-year-old's tunic can be mended one more time or whether it needs replacing entirely, which will require finding fabric or trading for fabric or making fabric. None of which you have time for, but all of which might be necessary. The house makes its nighttime sounds, the settling noises that all structures make as temperatures change and materials expand and contract. There is a particular creak in the roof beam that sounds almost like a footstep. And when you first moved into this house, it would startle you awake. But now you recognize it as simply the house talking to itself, complaining about the cold, or commenting on the wind, or doing whatever houses do when they creak. You have learned its vocabulary can distinguish between normal house sounds and sounds that indicate actual problems. Outside, the village is quiet except for the occasional dog bark. Someone's dog has heard something, probably a fox or a badger passing through, and feels obligated to announce this to everyone, fulfilling the ancient dog duty of alerting humans to things that humans cannot do anything about and probably do not care about. Another dog answers because dogs believe that all announcements require responses, and for a moment the village fills with barking before the dogs apparently decide that whatever they were announcing has been adequately announced, and silence returns. The cold continues its slow infiltration, finding every gap in your defenses. Your nose is cold, exposed to the air outside the blanket, and you consider pulling the blanket up to cover it, but that would expose your feet, which are already cold and would be colder if you removed blanket coverage. This is the fundamental problem of medieval sleeping arrangements. The blanket is never quite large enough to cover everything simultaneously, requiring constant decisions about which parts of your body deserve warmth, which parts must accept cold as their temporary fate. You compromise by pulling the blanket higher, but bending your knees, creating a more compact body shape that fits under the available blanket. This works reasonably well, except that bent knees are less comfortable than straight legs. So you are trading warmth for comfort, which is actually most of what medieval life consists of. Endless small trades between competing needs, where you never achieve perfect solutions, but only varying degrees of acceptable compromise. Your husband shifts in his sleep, his arm moving to rest across your waist, and you are briefly warmer where his arm touches you. This unconscious gesture of affection, or possibly just unconscious repositioning that happens to involve contact, pleases some part of your mind, the part that still notices these things even after 11 years, the part that remembers that you chose this person and he chose you, and you are facing life's difficulties together, which makes them fractionally more bearable. Sleep pulls at you more insistently now, your thoughts becoming less coherent, less linear. The transition from waking to sleeping happening in stages rather than all at once. You are aware of lying in bed, aware of being cold, aware of needing sleep, but also beginning to lose track of which thoughts are conscious processing and which are the beginning of dreams. That blurry boundary where reality and imagination start to overlap. You think about tomorrow, about the tasks that await, but the thoughts have started to take on the strange logic of half sleep, where you are baking bread, but also somehow flying. And this seems perfectly reasonable to your drowsing mind. You know you are approaching sleep because the thoughts stop making sense in the usual way and start making sense in the dream way, where contradictions coexist peacefully and causality becomes optional. The baby makes another sound, and you surface briefly from your descent into sleep, checking whether response is needed. He settles immediately, and you sink back down. the interruption barely registering your mother brain capable of monitoring children while your conscious mind is elsewhere. A skill that develops through necessity and practice, and the simple fact that mothers who cannot do this do not get adequate sleep and therefore struggle to function. Your breathing slows and deepens, matching rhythm with your husband's breathing. The two of you synchronizing unconsciously, a small harmony in the darkness. Your body temperature drops slightly to its nighttime level. Energy conservation happening automatically as your system shifts from active mode to recovery mode. Your muscles relax section by section, releasing the tension of the day's work, letting go of the constant readiness that waking requires. The straw beneath you has compressed enough that the worst of the poking has diminished, or possibly you have just become numb to it, your body making peace with discomfort through the simple strategy of stopping to notice it. This is another useful skill that medieval life teaches, the ability to tolerate discomfort by simply accepting it as the normal state of things rather than fighting it constantly. Your mind drifts through fragments of thoughts and half-formed dreams. You are spinning wool, but the wool is made of clouds, which makes sense in dream logic, even though it makes no sense at all. You are talking to your mother, who has been dead for 19 years, and she is giving you advice about bread that is probably actually advice about life. But you are too deep into sleep to analyze metaphors. The darkness seems to deepen, if that is possible, becoming more complete, more encompassing. You are aware of it less as absence of light and more as presence of darkness, a thing in itself rather than merely the lack of another thing. This darkness is absolute and total, and you float in it like floating in deep water, suspended between waking and sleeping, between consciousness and unconsciousness. Time becomes strange, the way it does in the transition to sleep. Minutes feel like hours, or hours feel like minutes, and you cannot tell which because time measurement requires consciousness, and you are losing consciousness, letting it go piece by piece, surrendering to the biological imperative that demands rest and recovery. Your thoughts scatter and reform in patterns that are not quite rational. You are concerned about the chickens, but also you are a chicken. And this seems to be the same concern viewed from different perspectives. You are cold, but also warm, both true simultaneously, because your feet are freezing while your core is adequately heated by a blanket and husband, and your sleeping brain finds nothing contradictory about this. The 5-year-old makes a sound in his sleep. Words that might be actual words or might just be sleep noises shaped like words. Impossible to tell in the darkness and in your own half-sleeping state. You register it without fully waking, filing it away as information that does not require action. Your monitoring system still functioning even as your conscious mind dissolves into sleep. The house settles more deeply into silence. The earlier creaks and groans haven't finished their evening performance. The structure has adjusted to the night's temperature and has apparently decided to be quiet about it. Or possibly you have simply stopped noticing the sounds, your attention turning inward as sleep claims you more completely. Your breathing has become automatic in a way that waking breathing is not. Your body taking over the process entirely, no conscious attention needed or wanted. In and out, slow and steady. Your ribcage rising and falling in the ancient rhythm that has sustained human life since humans existed. Your heart beats steadily, requiring no input, performing its endless work without thanks or acknowledgement. The most reliable worker you will ever employ. Sleep deepens around you and in you and through you, pulling you down into its depths, into the place where consciousness goes when it is not needed, when the body can perform its maintenance work without interference from the mind. You are almost fully asleep now, just the barest thread of awareness remaining, the part that will wake you if the baby cries or if something goes wrong, but otherwise content to let everything go, to surrender completely to rest. The cold has stopped bothering you, or rather, you have stopped noticing the cold, your body having made its adjustments and your mind having given up on complaint as useless. You are as warm as you are going to get given the circumstances. And that is adequate, because adequate is what you work with. Perfection being unavailable, inadequacy being sufficient. Your last coherent thoughts are simple and practical. Tomorrow will come. Work will need doing. Children will need feeding. Life will continue in its endless cycle. But that is tomorrow's concern. Tonight, right now, in this moment, you can rest. You have earned this sleep through today's labor. You have prepared as well as possible for tomorrow. And now you can simply be, simply exist in this dark and cold and crowded space, surrounded by family, sharing warmth and blankets, and the simple fact of survival. Sleep takes you fully now. Consciousness finally releasing its grip. The last bit of awareness fading into the general darkness. You are asleep, deeply and completely. Your body beginning its nightly work of repair and recovery. Your mind processing the day's experiences into memory and learning. Everything functioning as it should. The miraculous automatic systems that keep you alive operating without supervision. The household sleeps around you. 5 people sharing one small space, breathing the same air, generating warmth together, protecting each other through proximity and presence. This is how humans have always slept, in groups, in families, in tribes, using each other for warmth and safety and the comfort that comes from not being alone in the darkness. The night deepens and you sleep, and the world continues turning, indifferent to human rest or wakefulness. The stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, the moon rising and crossing the sky, time passing in its steady march forward. You are unaware of all of this, lost in sleep, lost in dreams, lost in the necessary unconsciousness that makes tomorrow possible. Your husband's arm is still across your waist, holding you gently even in sleep. 11 years of partnership expressed in this unconscious gesture. The children sleep in their pile, limbs tangled together in impossible configurations. Sharing warmth and space and the security of siblings. The house stands solid around you all, walls and roof providing shelter from the elements, creating the boundary between inside and outside, between safe and unsafe, between home and everything else. This is sleep in a medieval home, unglamorous and uncomfortable and entirely necessary. The nightly surrender to exhaustion that allows life to continue, that provides the rest required for tomorrow's work. It is not romantic or cozy or anything that modern people would choose voluntarily, but it is what you have, and it is enough, because enough is what survival requires, and survival is what you do. Night after night, day after day, year after year, the darkness holds you gently. The cold is manageable, the discomfort is tolerable, and you sleep deeply and dreamlessly, your body doing its work while your mind rests. Everything proceeding as it should, life continuing in its ancient patterns, unchanged by the centuries that will follow. The same basic human needs met in the same basic human ways. Tomorrow, you will wake and face new challenges. But tomorrow is not yet here. Tonight, there's only sleep, only rest. Only the temporary peace that comes from horizontal position and closed eyes and the surrender to exhaustion. You have done your work. You have cared for your family. You survived another day. And now you rest, earning this peace through your labor, deserving this quiet through your effort. The night continues. The darkness persists, and you sleep through all of it, deeply and completely, taking the rest you need to continue to persist, to survive another day in a life that consists entirely of survival. This is enough. It has always been enough. It will always be enough. And you sleep peacefully in the darkness and cold and crowded comfort of a medieval home, surrounded by family, protected by walls and roof and blankets, resting until morning comes and demands that you wake and begin again. You are deeply asleep now, in that profound stage where consciousness has completely surrendered. and the body is free to perform its nightly maintenance without interference from the mind. Your breathing is slow and regular, your heartbeat steady and strong. All the automatic systems functioning exactly as they should, requiring no attention or input, simply operating in the background. The way they have operated every night since your birth, and will continue operating until they stop, at which point you will also stop. But that is not tonight's concern. The darkness around you is absolute and unchanging, the kind of complete black that only exists in places where humans have not yet invented ways to push it back. This darkness has weight and presence, filling the room so thoroughly that it seems to have displaced the air. Though of course it is not, because you are breathing just fine, your lungs pulling in and pushing out air in their endless rhythm. The darkness is simply so complete that it becomes a thing you are aware of even in sleep, a presence rather than an absence. Time passes in that strange way it does during sleep, where hours compress into moments or expand into eternities, and you have no awareness of any of it, because awareness requires consciousness, and you possess none. The night moves forward in its steady progression, the earth continuing its rotation, bringing your small part of the world through the darkness toward eventual dawn. But dawn is hours away still, and you sleep through all of it, deeply and completely. Your body uses this time efficiently, performing all the maintenance tasks that cannot be done, while you are conscious and moving around and demanding that your body do other things. Small tears in muscle tissue are being repaired. The microscopic damage from carrying water buckets and kneading bread and lifting children being patched and reinforced. Your immune system is processing the day's exposures, fighting off the countless bacteria and viruses you encountered while touching chickens and children in food and surfaces, building defenses against potential infections before they can establish themselves. Your digestive system continues its slow work, breaking down the barley and bread and cheese you ate throughout the day, extracting nutrients and distributing them where they are needed, fueling the cellular processes that keep you alive. Your liver is filtering toxins. Your kidneys are processing waste. Your lungs are exchanging carbon dioxide for oxygen. All of these essential functions proceeding automatically while you are completely unaware of any of it. Lost in the depths of sleep, your brain, despite being offline for conscious purposes, is actually quite busy. The memories from today are being processed and consolidated. The sensory experiences and learned information being sorted and filed away for future reference. The feeling of the spindle in your hand, the weight of the water bucket, the exact temperature that means bread is ready to come out of the oven. All of these details are being strengthened and embedded in your neural pathways, making tomorrow's repetition of the same tasks slightly easier than today's. Dreams come and go. Strange narratives that make perfect sense while you're experiencing them in no sense at all if you were to remember them upon waking, which you will not, because dream memory is fragile and evaporates quickly when consciousness returns. You dream about spinning wool that turns into water that turns into thread again. And this transformation seems entirely reasonable to your dreaming mind. You dream about your mother teaching you something important, though what she is teaching keeps changing, and you can never quite grasp it before it becomes something else. You dream about flying, which is a common dream that humans have had throughout history, possibly because the idea of escaping gravity is universally appealing, even though it is completely impossible. In your dream, you fly over the village, seeing it from above, the small houses arranged in their familiar patterns. Smoke rising from chimneys that do not exist yet because it is night and fires are banked. The dream has no concern for logical consistency, and you do not notice or care because dream logic operates on different rules than waking logic. The baby stirs in his sleep, making small sounds that indicate he is moving between sleep stages but not fully waking. Your sleeping brain registers this, processes it, determines that no response is needed, and you continue sleeping without interruption. This monitoring system never fully shuts off, even in deepest sleep, because babies require constant supervision and evolution. Equip mothers with the ability to maintain awareness of their children even while unconscious. It is exhausting, but also essential. The reason human infants survive their vulnerable early years, despite being the most helpless mammals in existence. Your daughter shifts position slightly, her arm moving from across the baby to a new configuration that apparently her sleeping brain has determined is superior. She makes no sound, simply adjusts and settles again, sleeping peacefully in that way that makes you occasionally marvel at how easy she is compared to her brothers, who sleep like they are fighting invisible enemies and wake up looking like they have been through actual battles. The 5-year-old, speaking of fighting invisible enemies, suddenly flails dramatically in his sleep, one arm swinging out and nearly connecting with his sister's face before gravity brings it back down. Whatever dream he is having apparently involves significant physical activity, possibly running or fighting or dancing. And his body is attempting to participate despite being horizontal and surrounded by siblings. He does not wake, simply continues sleeping through his own vigorous movements. His sleeping brain apparently convinced that these activities are both necessary and appropriate. Your husband snores softly, a gentle rumbling that has become so familiar over 11 years that it no longer registers as sound, but simply as confirmation that he is present and alive and sleeping. His arm is still across your waist, heavy and warm, and even in sleep you appreciate this contact. This physical reminder that you are not alone in facing the world's difficulties. Partnership is many things, romantic and practical and complicated and simple. But at its most basic, it is this: another warm body in the cold darkness, sharing the burden of survival. The house makes occasional sounds, the timber frame settling and adjusting as temperatures continue to drop through the night. Wood contracts as it cools, creating small movements that translate into creaks and groans. The house's way of complaining about the cold. You do not wake for these sounds because you know them all, have learned over years which sounds are normal house behavior and which sounds indicate problems that require attention. These are normal sounds, the house simply talking to itself, and you sleep through them without concern. Outside, the village is silent except for natural sounds. An owl calls from somewhere in the distance, hunting for mice and voles that are foolish enough to be active at night. Another owl answers, because owls are territorial and like to remind each other of boundaries even at night, when everyone should really just focus on hunting and stop worrying about property disputes. The calls echo in the darkness and fade, and silence returns, profound and complete. The cold deepens as the night progresses toward its coldest point. That hour before dawn, when temperatures reach their minimum and even multiple blankets barely seem adequate. Your body has made its adjustments, conserving heat by reducing blood flow to extremities, prioritizing core temperature over the comfort of fingers and toes. Your feet are cold, will remain cold until morning, when movement and activity generate enough heat to warm them again. This is accepted as normal because cold feet at night are simply part of medieval existence, a minor discomfort that everyone experiences and no one can do much about except pile on more blankets or acquire more bed partners. And you have reached your limit on both strategies. Your face is cold where it is exposed to the air outside the blanket, your nose functioning as an unintentional thermometer, confirming that yes, it is indeed cold outside the protective wool cocoon. You do not consciously register this because you are deeply asleep, but some part of your sleeping brain notes it and ensures you remain burrowed under the blanket, your survival instincts functioning even when consciousness is offline. Time continues its forward march, indifferent to human sleep or wakefulness. Hours pass, though you have no awareness of this passing, no sense of duration or progression. You exist in the eternal present of deep sleep, where time is meaningless and there is only the current moment, stretching indefinitely in all directions. This is one of sleep's mercies. This release from time's constant pressure. This temporary freedom from the awareness that minutes are passing and tasks are waiting. And the future is approaching, whether you are ready or not. Your dreams shift and change, moving through different scenes and scenarios without any connecting logic. You are in the garden, but it is winter and also summer simultaneously. You are talking to the peddler, but he is also somehow your father who died when you were 10. You are baking bread that turns into birds and flies away. And you are frustrated by this, but also not surprised, because apparently in this dream, bread birds are a known phenomenon that happens regularly, and you should have been more careful. These dreams are your brain's way of processing information and experiences, sorting through the day's events and emotions and interactions, filing them away in the vast library of memory that you have been building since childhood. The dreams make no narrative sense, but they serve important cognitive functions, helping your brain consolidate learning, strengthen important memories, discard irrelevant information, and generally perform the mental housekeeping that keeps your mind functioning efficiently. You dream about your children, seeing them as they are, but also as they will be, future versions overlapping with present reality. Your daughter is grown and competent, managing her own household with skill and confidence. Your middle son is older, stronger, capable of real work rather than the child work he currently performs. The baby is walking and talking and no longer a baby, though in the dream he is still somehow simultaneously a baby, because dream logic allows contradictions to coexist peacefully. These dreams of your children's futures are probably more wish than prediction. Your mind creating visions of success and survival because the alternatives are too painful to contemplate even in dreams. Every parent wants to believe their children will survive and thrive, will grow up healthy and capable and happy, despite the overwhelming evidence that medieval childhood is dangerous and survival is never guaranteed. You dream optimistically because the alternative is nightmare. And even your sleeping brain wants to avoid that. The baby makes a sound that is almost a cry, hovering on the edge of waking, and immediately your sleeping brain responds, pulling you up through the layers of sleep toward consciousness, ready to wake fully if needed. But the baby settles again after a moment, the almost cry fading back into sleep sounds, and you sink back down into deeper sleep without having fully woken. This happens perhaps 5 or 6 times each night. These near wakings that your mother brain initiates out of caution, checking on children, confirming they are safe before allowing you to return to unconsciousness. Your husband has shifted position, rolling from his side onto his back, and his arm has moved from your waist, leaving you temporarily colder where his warmth had been. You adjust unconsciously, seeking his heat, moving closer, and he accommodates this in his sleep, his body responding to your proximity, even though his mind is completely offline. This is the dance of long marriage, two bodies learning to coordinate even in unconsciousness, adjusting to each other's movements and needs without requiring conscious negotiation. The straw beneath you has compressed further through the night, becoming less pokey and more simply lumpy, which is an improvement, though not a dramatic one. You have probably shifted position a dozen times since falling asleep, trying to find configurations that minimize discomfort, and each shift compresses the straw slightly more, creating a gradual improvement in sleeping surface quality that peaks around midnight and then slowly degrades again as the straw settles into its most compressed state and stops being flexible. Your bladder is beginning to make its presence known. That gradual pressure that builds through the night as your kidneys continue processing fluid and producing waste. This is one of the less pleasant aspects of medieval sleep, the high probability that you will need to get up at some point during the night to relieve yourself, which means leaving the warm blankets and walking through cold darkness to the chamber pot or outside to the designated relieving area, depending on weather and motivation. For now, the pressure is manageable and you continue sleeping. Your sleeping brain making the calculation that maintaining sleep is currently more important than addressing bladder concerns. Though this calculation will shift if the pressure increases enough. You have become skilled at this assessment through years of practice, knowing how long you can ignore the sensation before it becomes urgent. Though occasionally you miscalculate and wake up in genuine discomfort, having pushed your luck too far. The night is perhaps half over now. Though you have no way of knowing this, because time, measurement, and darkness without clocks is essentially impossible. The sun is still far below the horizon, the dawn still hours away, and you sleep on through this deepest part of night, your body working steadily on its maintenance tasks, your mind wandering through its strange dream landscapes, everything proceeding as it should. Your breathing has remained steady throughout, that slow, automatic rhythm that sustains life without requiring any conscious attention. Your heart continues its endless work, pumping blood through your body, delivering oxygen and nutrients to cells that need them, removing waste products that cells produce. Your temperature regulation system maintains your core warmth despite the external cold, though it has largely given up on your extremities, as lost causes that will have to wait until morning to be warm again. The wool blanket covering you has become slightly damp from body, moisture that you have been releasing all night through breathing and subtle perspiration. This dampness is not noticeable enough to wake you, but it slightly reduces the blanket's insulating properties, meaning you are fractionally colder than you were earlier in the night. Medieval people accept this as normal because perfectly dry blankets would require technology that does not exist yet, and slightly damp wool is still warmer than no wool at all. Your daughter has somehow migrated closer to the baby during the night, her instinctive, protective nature expressing itself even in sleep. She has positioned herself between the baby and the cold wall, using her own body as a windbreak. 8 years old, and already demonstrating the caretaking instincts that will define much of her life. This behavior is both touching and slightly sad. Childhood responsibility starting so early. But it is also simply how things work in families where everyone must contribute to everyone else's survival. The 5-year-old has achieved a sleeping position that seems to defy the laws of physics. One leg bent at an angle that should not be. Comfortable and both arms flung out to the sides as if he is trying to fly or possibly trying to take up as much space as possible to prevent his siblings from encroaching on his territory. Children are remarkably flexible and can sleep in positions that would cause permanent injury in adults. Their young bodies tolerant of configurations that make no ergonomic sense. Your mind continues its dream wandering, moving through scenarios that become increasingly strange as the night deepens. You are a spinning thread, but also the thread is spinning you, and this reversal seems philosophically significant in the dream, though it would be completely meaningless if analyzed while awake. You are talking to chickens who are giving you advice about household management, and their advice is surprisingly practical despite coming from creatures whose brains are the size of walnuts. You dream about bread that never rises, which is probably anxiety about tomorrow's baking manifesting in dream form. You dream about water buckets that are impossibly heavy, which is probably your body's memory of carrying water expressing itself symbolically. You dream about your mother again, still teaching you things, still patient and present, though she has been dead for 19 years and exists now only in memory and in these occasional dream visits where she feels as real as she did in life. The house has settled into its deepest quiet, all the evening creaking finished, the structure having adjusted completely to the night's temperature. The silence is so profound that if you were awake, you would hear your own heartbeat, the rush of blood in your ears, the small sounds that your own body makes constantly, but that are usually masked by environmental noise. But you are not awake. You are deeply asleep, and you hear nothing, perceive nothing, simply exist in a suspended state that sleep provides. Outside, the night continues its slow progression, the stars wheeling overhead in their eternal patterns. The moon, if it is visible, crossing the sky in its ancient path. The village sleeps, every household dark and quiet, every family sheltered in their small spaces, everyone engaged in the same biological necessity, the same nightly surrender to exhaustion. Dogs sleep, chickens sleep, livestock sleeps. Even the usually vigilant barn cats have probably found warm spots to curl up and rest. The world is at rest, or at least this small part of it is at rest. The English countryside sleeping under its blanket of darkness, waiting for dawn to bring light and activity and the resumption of all the work that defines human existence. But dawn is still hours away, and for now there is only sleep, only darkness, only the profound quiet of a world at rest. You sleep on, deeply and completely, your body performing its essential maintenance, your mind processing the day's experiences, everything functioning as it should. You are warm enough under your scratchy wool blanket, pressed against your husband's warmth, surrounded by the sounds of your children breathing. You are uncomfortable in some ways, cold in others, but overall you are adequately rested, adequately sheltered, adequately safe. This is medieval sleep in its essence. Neither comfortable nor particularly pleasant, but functional and sufficient, providing the rest necessary to face another day of work and survival. You do not need luxury or comfort. You need to wake tomorrow capable of performing the same tasks you perform today, and this sleep, uncomfortable and cold and crowded as it is, will provide that capability. The night deepens toward its end, though the end is still far off. You sleep through it all, unaware of time passing, unaware of cold deepening, unaware of anything except the dreams that flicker through your unconscious mind and fade before they can be remembered. You are simply asleep, simply resting, simply doing what humans have done every night for all of history, surrendering consciousness in trust that morning will come and life will continue. And it will continue because it always does, because humans are remarkably persistent at surviving despite comfortable sleeping arrangements and cold feet and scratchy blankets. You will wake tomorrow and work and care for your family and face whatever challenges the day brings. And tomorrow night you will sleep again in the same darkness and cold and discomfort. And this cycle will continue until it does not, until age or illness or accident stops it. But that is not tonight's concern. Tonight you simply sleep, deeply and completely, taking the rest your body demands, earning through today's labor this night's peace. The darkness holds you, the cold surrounds you, your family breathes around you, and you rest profoundly and completely, in the simple way that humans have always rested, will always rest, night after night, year after year, in darkness and cold and the shared warmth of family, surviving together through another night, preparing through rest for another day of the endless work that is life. The deepest part of night has passed, and you are moving through what would be called the small hours if anyone were awake to call them anything, which no one is, because this is the time when sleep is most profound and waking seems most impossible. Your body has descended into the deepest stages of rest, the periods when restoration happens most effectively, when cellular repair work proceeds most efficiently, when your brain does its most intensive processing and consolidation of memories and learning. You are so deeply asleep that you could probably sleep through a reasonable amount of noise or disruption, though not through a baby crying or a child calling for you, because those sounds penetrate even the deepest sleep through the mysterious mother detection system that evolution has equipped you with. But ordinary sounds, normal nighttime noises, pass through your awareness without registering, your sleeping brain filtering them out as irrelevant, allowing you to continue your deep rest undisturbed. Your dreams have become more fragmented now, less narrative and more impressionistic, flashes of images and sensations that flicker through your unconscious mind without forming coherent stories. You see your daughter's face, your husband's hands, a loaf of bread, a chicken, your mother's smile, all disconnected and floating, appearing and disappearing without context or connection. This is the deeper level of dreaming beneath the story dreams, where your brain is processing more fundamental information, sorting and filing and strengthening. The basic sensory memories that make up your accumulated experience. Your body temperature has dropped to its lowest point of the night. Your metabolic rate slowed to its minimum. Every system operating in energy conservation mode while still maintaining the essential functions that keep you alive. Your heart rate has slowed. Your breathing has become even more measured and regular. Your blood pressure has decreased. You are in the physiological state that humans are designed to occupy for approximately 8 hours out of every 24. The state where healing and growth happen, where immune function is strengthened, where neurological consolidation occurs. Medieval people do not know about metabolic rates, or immune function, or neurological consolidation, but they know from experience that sleep is essential, that people who do not get adequate sleep become weak and sick and unable to work effectively. The science will not be understood for centuries, but the practical reality has been obvious for as long as humans have existed. You need sleep the way you need food and water, and deprivation of any of these essentials will eventually kill you. Though sleep deprivation takes longer than food or water deprivation, and is therefore slightly less immediately concerning, but still very much concerning. The baby stirs again, this time more insistently, and you surface from deep sleep like rising from underwater, moving up through the layers toward consciousness. Your eyes open in the complete darkness and see nothing, which is disorienting for the half second before your brain remembers that darkness means seeing nothing is normal. The baby makes more sounds, progressing from stirring to actual discomfort, and you know these sounds well enough to interpret them even in your half-wake state. He needs feeding, which means you must wake enough to nurse him, though you can do this while remaining mostly asleep, a skill that mothers develop through necessity and practice. You shift position carefully, try not to disturb your husband too much, though he is sleeping heavily enough that a reasonable amount of movement will not wake him. The baby's sounds become more urgent, approaching actual crying, and you reach for him in the darkness, your hands finding him through memory and familiarity rather than sight. You pull him close, settling him into nursing position, and he latches on immediately with the fierce determination of someone who has been waiting for this and is not interested in delays. His small, warm body presses against yours, and you adjust the blanket to cover both of you, creating a little pocket of shared warmth in the cold darkness. This is one of the more pleasant aspects of nighttime nursing, the quiet intimacy of feeding your child while the rest of the world sleeps, though it would be more pleasant if it did not require you to be awake. When you desperately want to be asleep, your daughter has woken slightly at the sounds, her own mother brain already developing even at 8 years old, and she makes a small questioning sound. You murmur reassurance that everything is fine, just the baby needing feeding, and she settles back into sleep immediately with the enviable ability children have to transition between sleep and waking without the groggy confusion that adults experience. You sit in the darkness with your nursing baby, mostly asleep yourself, your body performing this task on automatic, while your mind hovers in the space between waking and sleeping. The baby nurses with a rhythmic pulling that is both soothing and slightly uncomfortable, the sensation one that you have experienced hundreds of times by now and will experience hundreds more before he weans. You have mixed feelings about nursing, appreciating the convenience and the health benefits and the bond it creates, while also sometimes resenting the constant demands it places on your body. The way you are never entirely your own person, but always potentially needed by this small creature who relies completely on you for sustenance. But these resentments are minor and fleeting, easily overwhelmed by the surge of affection you feel when you look down at him in the darkness and see nothing but know he is there, warm and alive and growing, one more child successfully kept alive through infancy's dangerous period. Not every child survives. You know this from experience and observation, and the fact that all three of yours are currently alive and healthy is not something you take for granted, though you try not to think too much about the fragility of it all, because thinking about it makes you anxious, and anxiety serves no useful purpose. The baby finishes nursing and immediately falls back asleep with the speed that only babies and very drunk people can achieve. Consciousness to unconsciousness in seconds. No transition period required. You hold him a moment longer, reluctant to move, and risk waking him again, enjoying the warmth and weight of him against your chest. Then carefully, moving with the exaggerated slowness of someone trying not to wake a sleeping baby, you ease him back into his spot next to his sister, tucking the blanket around him, ensuring he is warm and secure. You settle back into your own sleeping position, pressing against your husband's warmth, pulling the scratchy wool blanket back over yourself, and wait for sleep to reclaim you. This takes longer than you would like, because nursing has woken you more fully than you intended. And now your mind is taking the opportunity to remind you of all the things you need to worry about, helpfully providing a middle of the night anxiety session that you definitely did not request and do not want. You try to quiet your thoughts, focusing on your breathing, on the warmth of the blanket, on the sounds of your family sleeping around you. But your mind is persistent and keeps returning to concerns about the roof leak and the brown hen, and whether you have enough grain stored, and whether your husband's cough is getting worse. You know this worrying is useless, that you cannot solve any of these problems in the middle of the night. But knowing this does not stop your brain from worrying anyway, because brains are not particularly good at following reasonable instructions. Your bladder is now making more insistent demands, having built up pressure during the hours you have been sleeping, and you realize you can no longer ignore it without risking genuine discomfort. This means you must get up, leave the warm blankets, navigate the dark house, and address this biological necessity, which is annoying but unavoidable. You briefly consider trying to hold it until morning, but morning is still hours away, and you know from experience that this strategy rarely works, and usually results in lying awake and uncomfortable for the rest of the night, which is worse than just getting up now. You ease out from under the blanket, immediately hit by cold air that makes you reconsider every decision that led to this moment. The floor is freezing against your bare feet, the packed earth having absorbed the night's cold and now radiating it back with enthusiasm. You stand carefully, orienting yourself in the complete darkness, remembering the layout of the room, where furniture is positioned, where children are sleeping, which path leads to the door without stepping on anyone or anything. You navigate by memory and touch, moving slowly and carefully, your hands extended in front of you to detect obstacles, your feet feeling for the floor before committing weight to each step. This is a skill you've developed over years of nighttime bathroom trips, this ability to move through complete darkness without falling over or injuring yourself. Though you have had a few close calls over the years involving forgotten objects, left in unusual places, you reach the door and carefully lift the bar, moving slowly to minimize noise, though the scraping sound it makes seems impossibly loud in the silence. You ease the door open, and slightly less cold air comes in from outside, which is somehow colder than inside, despite the house barely being warmer. Medieval buildings having minimal insulation and maximum drafts. You step outside into the night, closing the door behind you to prevent too much cold from entering the house. The outdoor darkness is different from the indoor darkness, less enclosed, more expansive, with a faint suggestion of sky above, even though you cannot actually see the sky through the cloud cover. You make your way to the designated relieving area, moving carefully because tripping in the dark while needing to relieve yourself would be both painful and embarrassing, even though no one would witness it except possibly a confused chicken. You attend to your biological needs quickly, the cold encouraging efficiency, and the relief is immediate and significant enough that you briefly forgive your bladder for waking you. The cold is intense enough that you can see your breath, Small clouds forming and dissipating in the darkness, evidence that yes, it is indeed quite cold outside, and you should probably get back inside before you freeze. You navigate back to the door, feeling for the familiar shape of it in the darkness, and ease it open again, slipping back inside and closing it behind you. The house feels marginally warmer by comparison, though objectively it is still cold, just less aggressively cold than outside. You replace the door bar carefully, securing the house again. Then begin the careful journey back to bed, retracing your path through the darkness. Your feet are now completely frozen, the brief trip outside having eliminated any residual warmth they possessed, and getting back under the blanket becomes urgently necessary. You reach the sleeping platform and ease yourself back onto it, trying not to disturb your husband too much. Though he makes a small sound that suggests you have partially succeeded and partially failed at this goal. You pull the blanket back over yourself and press your frozen feet against his legs, stealing his warmth shamelessly because he is asleep and cannot object, and also this is part of the marriage agreement. Even if it was never explicitly stated, he makes another sound, this one more clearly a complaint about your ice block feet, but he does not move away, accepting this as the price of sharing a bed with someone who has to get up in the middle of the night. You feel guilty for approximately 3 seconds before the warmth of his legs begins to thaw your feet, and gratitude replaces guilt. This is partnership, taking turns being the cold one and the warm one, accepting each other's biological necessities even when they are inconvenient. Sleep pulls at you again, your brief period of wakefulness having exhausted its purpose, your body ready to return to rest now that immediate needs have been addressed. Your mind tries to restart its worry session, but you are too tired to engage with it properly, and the worries fade before they can gain traction. Your breathing slows and deepens, your muscles relax, and you drift back toward sleep, back down into the depths where consciousness dissolves and rest becomes complete. The baby sleeps peacefully, satisfied and full, his small body radiating the contentment of someone whose needs have been met. Your daughter has not stirred since your return, sleeping through your entire absence, and return with the enviable ability children have to sleep through anything that does not directly concern them. The 5-year-old has somehow rotated 90 degrees during your absence and is now sleeping perpendicular to his original position, feet where his head was, head where his feet were. Though how he achieved this rotation while remaining asleep is a mystery that will never be solved. Your husband's breathing has returned to its deep sleep rhythm, your brief disturbance having barely interrupted his rest. His arm settles across your waist again, the familiar weight and warmth, and you feel the small comfort of being held, being connected, not being alone in facing the night's challenges, even when the challenges are as mundane as needing to relieve yourself and having cold feet. The night is perhaps 3/4 over now, though you have no way of knowing this precisely. Dawn is still a few hours away, far enough that returning to sleep makes sense. It's close enough that when you wake again, it will be time to start the day. You have perhaps 2 or 3 hours of uninterrupted sleep remaining, assuming the baby does not wake again and no other emergencies arise, and you intend to make the most of this time, sinking back into sleep with the determination of someone who knows rest is precious and should not be wasted on worrying about things that cannot be. Dressed until daylight anyway, sleep comes more easily this time, your body eager to return to the state it was pulled from, and you descend quickly through the layers of consciousness into the deeper currents below. Your breathing synchronizes with your husband's breathing, the two of you inhaling and exhaling in harmony, a small coordination that happens unconsciously, but that nevertheless creates a sense of unity, of partnership, of two people moving through life and sleep together. Your dreams return, less vivid now, more gentle. Your mind having processed the most urgent concerns and now simply floating through pleasant images and sensations. You dream about sunlight, which seems impossibly far away in this cold darkness, but which will return eventually, to bringing warmth and light and the ability to see what you are doing. You dream about bread rising perfectly, achieving the ideal height and texture. A small domestic success that brings disproportionate satisfaction. You dream about your children grown and safe, which is the dream that underlies all other dreams, the fundamental hope that animates your entire existence. You want them to survive, to thrive, to live long enough to have their own children and face their own challenges. This is not guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed in medieval life, but it is possible. And possibility is what you work toward every day, every night, every moment. The house has settled into its deepest quiet. The silence so complete that it has texture and weight. Your family sleeps around you, 5 people in one small space, breathing the same air, sharing warmth and shelter, and the simple fact of being alive together. This is what family means in practical terms, not abstract concepts of love and duty, but concrete reality of shared breathing and shared blankets and shared survival. You sleep deeply now, completely, your body taking full advantage of these remaining hours of rest. Your face relaxes into the softness that only comes in deep sleep. The worry lines smoothing out, the constant tension of waking life releasing completely. If anyone could see you in the darkness, which they cannot, they would see you looking younger, more peaceful, temporarily free from the burdens that define your waking hours. Your heart beats steadily. That reliable worker that never stops, never complains, just continues its essential task of keeping blood flowing, oxygen moving, life sustained. Your lungs expand and contract in their ancient rhythm, pulling in air and pushing it out. Participating in the exchange of gases that makes consciousness possible. Your digestive system continues its slow work. Your immune system fights its invisible battles. Your nervous system maintains its essential functions. All of this happening without your awareness or input, the miraculous automatic systems that keep you alive. The night moves toward its end, though the end is still not visible, still hours away in the future that you will wake to face. The darkness remains complete, the cold remains intense. But you are warm enough under your blanket, pressed against your husband, surrounded by your children, and this is enough. Not comfortable, not luxurious, but enough, adequate, sufficient. The baseline level of survival that humans have worked with for most of history, and which is, when you think about it, actually quite remarkable. That you have achieved even this much given the challenges involved. You do not think about this because you are deeply asleep. But if you did think about it, you might feel something like pride or satisfaction at having kept your family sheltered and fed and alive through another day, another week, another month, another year. This is no small achievement in the 14th century, where so many things can go wrong and frequently do, where survival is never guaranteed and must be earned daily, through work and care and luck and the accumulated competence that you have built through years of practice and observation, and occasional failure. But you do not think about this, because thinking is for waking hours, and these are sleeping hours, and you use them as they are meant to be used, for rest and recovery, and the essential biological processes that make tomorrow possible. You sleep deeply, peacefully, your work paused, your responsibilities temporarily set aside, your constant vigilance finally allowed to ease. The world continues turning, the night continues progressing, and you sleep through all of it, deeply and completely, trusting that morning will come and bring with it new challenges and new work and new opportunities to demonstrate the competence that defines your life. But morning is not here yet. For now, there is only sleep, only darkness, only rest. Your children breathe around you in their various rhythms. 3 different patterns of inhalation and exhalation. 3 small lives that depend on you continuing to wake up and continuing to be competent, and continuing to make the 1,000 daily decisions that keep them alive and growing. This responsibility is enormous, and would be crushing if you thought about it too much. So you do not think about it too much. You just do it, day after day, night after night, waking and sleeping and waking again in the endless cycle that is life. Your husband sleeps beside you, his breathing steady and his warmth constant, and you are grateful for him in ways that have nothing to do with romance and everything to do with practical partnership. Two adults managing a household is significantly easier than one adult managing a household, even accounting for the additional work that comes with having a husband who needs feeding and whose clothes need mending and who occasionally makes decisions that you have to fix. The net benefit is positive, and in medieval life, you cannot ask for more than net positive. You take what advantage you can get and you build on it, and you survive. You sleep on through the deep night, through the hours when sleep is most profound and rest is most complete. Your body works steadily at its maintenance tasks. Your mind processes its accumulated experiences, and everything functions as it should. It's a remarkable coordination of systems that makes human life possible. You are unaware of any of this because awareness would interfere with the processes. So consciousness has been shut down to allow the body and brain to work uninterrupted. The night is kind to you in its way, providing the darkness and quiet and separation from daytime concerns that sleep requires. You rest deeply in this kindness, taking what the night offers, storing up energy and resilience for the day ahead. This is the gift of sleep, this temporary release from consciousness and responsibility. This brief period when you can simply be rather than constantly do, and you are. Simply being, simply breathing, simply existing in the darkness and cold and shared warmth of family. Sleeping through another night in a medieval home where comfort is limited but survival is achieved. Where life is hard but continues nonetheless. Where each day is survived and each night is survived, and slowly, incrementally, life accumulates through these survivals into something that resembles meaning, or at least resembles the pattern of a life lived. You sleep deeply and completely in the darkness that will eventually lighten, in the cold that will eventually warm, in the night that will eventually become day. But those transitions are still ahead. For now, there is only sleep, only rest, only the peaceful unconsciousness that makes everything else possible. The house is dark and quiet and cold, and you are deeply asleep within it, surrounded by family, protected by walls and roof and blankets, resting until morning comes and demands that you wake and begin again the endless work of survival. But morning can wait. For now, there is only sleep, deep, complete, essential sleep, and it is enough.